More than 50,000 Britons are refusing to work in the biggest strike in more than 3 decades. They're protesting their below inflation pay. London's Underground also remains shut. Train services will also be cancelled. Strike leaders insist the campaign will run for as long as necessary. In Belgium, tens of thousands of people took part in the march in Brussels on Monday, demanding measures to offset record high inflation. Thousands also took to the streets in Ireland after inflation surged to its highest level since the 1980s, prompting cost of living protests across the country. Germany is also facing certain recession if already faltering Russian gas supplies completely stop. And Italy is saying it will consider offering financial backing to help companies refill gas storage to avoid a deeper crisis in winter. Welcome to the Spotlight. I'm your host, Behruz Najafi. Let's see who is joining me in this episode. Historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Bristol. Also with us will be Secretary General of the CIPI Foundation, Paolo Raffone. He's joining us out of Brussels. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Now, Tony, first off, the big picture question. Now, what in your opinion is the #1 factor responsible for this economic chaos in Europe? Of course, we'll be discussing the situation in some European countries later on in the show.
Well, look, you're hearing my voice. Most people in Britain will never hear my voice, even though I was trained on the BBC to report on these sorts of matters, and they won't see my face. Some would say that's a good thing, but look, it's because I am giving a point of view which is anti-finance capitalism, and it's not just me, it's the leaders of the RMT, Rail Maritime Transport Union here in Britain, that are doing the same. They're saying that finance capitalism is basically killing the entire economy because it's making it impossible for people to afford to live, and therefore people are being driven out of the industry. So I'm just one of those voices silenced in the UK now because as people like Michael Hudson have pointed out, finance capitalism is killing the host. Its profit is the only thing that matters, and the real problem is that the living costs in Britain and elsewhere have become astronomical. But basically here in Britain, these are many of the things which were privatised by Margaret Thatcher back in the 1980s, things like electricity, gas, water, housing, all the things, transport as well, by the way, all the things which we need just simply to get by day to day are now in private hands, and those privateers are basically raking off massive profits because they're not contributing anything anymore. They can't compete financially with the rest of the world. An economic failure Britain and America now are, and much of Europe too, with the notable exception of the Germans. We can't manufacture things because living costs and all these other costs are so high. That's why they call it the cost of living crisis. But the crux of it is rent. How much it costs to house yourself is now roughly 100 times what it costs to, say, for example, to compare it to what it costs to actually build a home to what it costs to rent and buy a home in Britain today is 99% of that money is going to people who are making a profit off of your need to find somewhere to live. And the most shattering and shameful thing is that we're hearing it here on Press TV, but we're not hearing it anywhere really in the mainstream press in the UK. The fact that effectively we've got a form of capitalism, finance capitalism, which is completely taking over from the old-fashioned capitalism, which was real free market capitalism, where people were paid sensible wages and that the people who were making profits in the country, the capitalists, weren't preying on people's need for water, fuel, food, energy and transport, these kind of basic essentials. So that's what's at the bottom of it. But when it comes to the rail strike, we have something like 50,000 people out on strike. They are very, very clear about they're sending a message to the rest of the public sector workers in Britain, because although this is one of the great scandals of the rail strike, the government actually owns 3 of the large rail franchises here in Britain. The government has flatly refused, the Tories have flatly refused to even talk to and negotiate with the union. So it's hardly surprising that there's been a strike. It's almost as if the government wants a strike. Maybe they want to try and sack all these people and employ robots to do their jobs, or cheap migrant workers who have never been trained to run a railway to do their jobs, because that's the kind of Britain we're living in today.
Okay. Now, Paolo, I want to ask you this question. Is it Russia or the wrong policies of the Western states that have wreaked havoc with this so-called cost of living and soaring energy prices in Europe and the U.S.?
Well, the simplified binary narrative says that is so simple. Everybody understands that this is not in the West, in the Western economy and finance has started crumbling in 2006, 2008, and it has never recovered to the situation prior to that date. In order to have the system afloat, the governments have been printing quantitative easing, which is creating money out of nowhere, basically, which has allowed a sort of normalcy to appear, but in fact it has devalued the value of those currencies as well as put all the premises for inflation. The pandemic came as a help in the sense that it has been hiding the reality of the economy, which was already in distress. And because of the pandemic, even further quantitative easing has been pulled into the market. Then the pandemic ended. And in fact, a restart of the normal life and economy and consumption has pushed even further the inflationary points. And therefore, this has been the situation prior to the Russian military operation. The military operation has increased the situation for Europe, especially for Europe, because it has added the energy supply problem, which has pushed up even further the inflationary data. But we cannot say in a very simplified way that this is the fault of Putin.
Right. Okay, Tony, the European Union is under mounting pressure for spending billions of euros on arming Ukraine, and that's at a time when the bloc's citizens are struggling to make ends meet, as you know. And that was echoed on the streets of Brussels yesterday by ralliers. Still, the EU is planning to slap more sanctions on Moscow or the war in Ukraine. Is this the right decision?
Well, this is a decision which is being made by an elite cabinet of people who seem to support. So they are in the process of extraditing Julian Assange to the United States, who's one of the greatest investigative journalists of the 21st century and has not committed any crime in Britain whatsoever. That, I'm afraid, is what we have for leaders now in Britain. And the other thing is this matter of inflation, particularly in energy prices. We've now got general inflation because that's what happens when you start putting up energy prices. Everything starts to cost more. Is actually the cause of that is these new green taxes that the British have brought in. In the UK, we are supposed to have had a Brexit. Now, this is something which is coming right across the European Union. Most of them happening, many of them happening, increases in fuel prices covered up by the oil companies who increased their price before Christmas. This is supposed to be a European thing, but the British have also sneakily, with the collusion of the oil cartels, brought these price increases in fuel in too, and this has a massive knock-on effect. Now they've made an attempt to blame this on the Russians. Of course, that's not gone down very well in Britain, and I don't think that that's really succeeded to get through. What's happening, of course, is what we're having is the World Economic Forum, Prince Charles and his green tax friends, Klaus Schwab and the rest of them, are doing a great reset. They're doing it very in slow motion, and what they're doing is they're driving many ordinary people in Britain down into debt. When we're looking at particularly at what's happening with the train strikes, which are really massively affecting the life of Britons over the next week and possibly further into the summer. They've said it possibly even on until Christmas. Is the disruption that it's causing to people is enormous. And there seems to be a certain delight within the green lobby that the energy prices are being forced up, and less people have to pay more for their cars. But of course, what this means to the world markets is actually more coal will be being used around the world because oil prices are so high. Also, automation is one of the big reasons for this strike, and this is, of course, replacing employed human beings with decent contracts that the railway staff presently have with automation. So that is to say, within a year or so, the British Railways, the organisers, who, by the way, about a collection of something like 20 or 25 of them get paid anything between £125,000 a year and £800,000 a year for the chief executive. So they're creaming off the money that's coming in from these rail passengers for themselves. But what they're doing is they're using that to then sack the staff. Because this is what the shareholders like. They like more profit. What they're doing is old-fashioned language, is they're sweating the assets. So they're using the assets, they're asset stripping, and they're using the assets to just get rid of all of the costs. And the costs include human beings who look after people's safety on the trains. They want to have even some of these trains with no person on them. So what happens if there's a crash? What happens if there's violence, there's some hooligans, a disturbance on the train? There'll be nobody there to do anything about it. But they don't really care, I'm afraid. The shareholders don't care about that because they've dehumanized these railways using automation. So although it's not just about the railways, I know you want to talk about the other things. I think it's a great example of how in Britain one of the basic bits of infrastructure is being sweated and sweated by the finance capitalists, and finally they're feeling the pinch, and I hope that there's a settlement in this dispute and that the people can retain their dignity and their decent pay. Some people, by the way, have been sacked from the railways. I was speaking to someone on a train the other day and they've been told, you're going to have to reapply for your own job and it's going to be 20% less pay. This is the way they're treating their really important assets who talk to the customers every day. These executives never see a customer, never speak to a rail passenger at all. They just sit in raking in the profits and dishing them out to the shareholders.
Okay, Paolo, speaking of the UK, the government is under a lot of pressure, for the economic policies, and this is while the country is facing high inflation. So what is it that the Downing Street and the Johnson administration has failed to do to address the issue?
I didn't get the final part of your question, sorry.
No, I'm talking about the economic situation and the cost of living crisis, energy prices, and all the economic issues that Britain is facing.
Yeah, but Britain is the best example of what the other interlocutor is saying. In Britain, since the early 80s, have been applied the neoliberal recipes of finance capitalism, and we are seeing what is happening. And it's not the first time. The situation is really out of control. Global Britain is a beautiful story that has been circled by Johnson, but in fact, instead of global Britain, there will be a smaller Britain and much poorer than before. That's the reality. But this is something which should be coming as a warning to the rest of the Western countries, because after Britain there is the US. In the US the situation is not going any better. Western Europe is strangled with nonsense sanctions and wrong policies which are being implemented, especially in the energy sector, and therefore the entire Western primacy in economy is under question at this moment.
Now, Tony, let's take a glance at Germany. BDI Industry Association has slashed its economic growth forecast for 2020 to 1.5%. It revised it down from 3.5% expected before the Ukraine war. And it's saying that a halt in the Russian gas deliveries would make recession inevitable. So your assessment of how Germany is impacted?
Well, Germany is likely to be more impacted in many ways than Britain because it's still a very important industrial hub. They still have in Germany something called industrial capitalism, which is the need to actually make things and sell them in order to make money. And they're very good at it in Germany. The Brits have basically sold out years ago. And the interesting thing for me is the connection between these policies and NATO and the military policies towards Russia, Iran, and China, because as Michael Hudson points out in his new book, which is about I think it's subtitled the future of civilization, finance capitalism, industrial capitalism, or socialism. He's pointed out that we have to keep, and in fact the war that's going on even now in Russia is really an ideological war in a way between countries that believe that you've just got to be able to sell everything off to the highest bidder, including your national infrastructure, and other countries like Russia, etc., that think that the government has to play an independent role in making sure that the infrastructure of the country is supplied at cost so that people can start businesses and actually compete. What happens is in finance capitalism is everything like here in Britain now. The cost of living becomes so expensive that there is barriers to entry to the market, and there's no real entrepreneurialism going on anymore. All the people who got trained in industries and now seem to be working in these other industries like the railways, etc., which are now being sweated. The assets are being sweated there. But as a result of all of this, we've got a basic clash of civilizations going on, as Hudson points out, between the West, which is really where we're talking about finance capitalism, money rules, and the Russians and other powers in the world, which are realistically saying that in order to have sovereignty, the government must assert itself and take control of these various key industries that we've got around the world. And also, of course, we've been seeing protests here in Britain too, hardly covered in the mainstream press because they're embarrassed to see thousands of people out on the streets on Sunday supporting the rail workers and also lobbying the government, protesters, a peaceful protest, lobbying the government, saying we need more government help and intervention to make sure that people can actually afford to feed their children, to pay the rent, to maybe have a little bit left to go down the swimming pool and enjoy a day out with the children. That's the sort of thing I'm afraid Britons are now finding it very difficult to afford these things.
Okay, now, Paolo, let's take a look at Italy now. Alongside others such as Germany, Denmark, Austria, and Netherlands has activated the first early warning stage of its three-stage plan to cope with a gas supply crisis. So let's take a look at the situation in Italy and how badly that country is affected.
Well, the choices that the European Union made, especially in the gas sector, in terms of policy, were evidently wrong when they decided to adhere to the concept of spot prices for the gas. This is now turning as a boomerang on the economies of Europe because prices are going up. We have to import this gas from somewhere else than Russia at prices that will be skyrocketing. All of this will increase the malfunctioning of the economy and the social unrest. This is clear. The families already, many countries, find difficult to reach the end of the month to pay the bills and the rents. Prices are so high, evidently. I mean, it's not just a matter of statistics. It's enough to go to the market and buy your daily food, and you will see how prices have doubled. And we are here talking about little measures of the central bank to contrast an inflation which is far beyond the official rate, evidently.
Okay. Now, Tony, the sky-high European price has attracted more LNG cargoes, but Europe lacks the infrastructure to meet all its needs from LNG, and that's why the global LNG market is already stretched. Disruptions to a major U.S. producer of also liquefied natural gas that provided shipments to Europe added to this challenge. So what's in the offing?
Well, that's a good question. Look, by saying we're going to take Russian energy, the Brits have really shot themselves in the foot massively. I mean, this is a stupid thing to do, unless, of course, you want to create a crisis in your domestic economy and amongst your domestic people. I think this is just how crazy some of our leaders are in this part of the world, is they realise that they can't beat the Russians. The Russians are actually too tough, and their soldiers are, and their nuclear weapons are very, very strong too. So they've turned their ire on their own people. That's the only explanation I can see for this masochistic idea of completely cutting off gas and oil, which the Europeans and the British seem to want to do, and the Americans. And now, of course, this benefits the Americans. So it means the Americans are going to be able to sell more of their energy to Europe. And that, I think, is the real agenda, that this is a way of just knuckling down the Europeans to be obedient to American wishes. But we've got a massive structural problem, and that is that the governments we elect have really got very little or no power anymore. The people who are really running the show are the oil cartels, the banks, the people like the Bilderberg conferences, which I've been studying for many years. These are groups of elites, including the media. And what shocks me as a former, shall we say, civil servant journalist here in Britain, is to see that the editors of the media here in the West go to these secret conferences and swear secrecy. They don't write about them. They won't tell anybody what goes on in there, largely because their assets of their businesses and many of their bonuses come from the fact that many of these top executives around the Western world have got their money squirreled away in these tax havens. They're not paying any tax, whilst what's happening is the middle classes and the poorest people in Europe and around the West are now paying the tax that they should be paying. So that's, I'm afraid, the structural problem that's at the heart of this. And I think it's fairly clear to say that this is the sort of thing that the Russians are simply not prepared to put up with in Eastern Europe, nor are people in Donbass and the Donetsk. By the way, 15,000 of which have been killed by the Ukrainian army over the last, with the collusion of the West and people like Victoria Nuland, over the last 8 years since the 2014 coup there. People are not prepared to accept this. Also in Ukraine, by the way, when the coup happened in 2014, what you saw was a cutting of the money going to the regions in Ukraine. All of it was then concentrated in the center, and it was starving the regions of the cash that they were paying in tax and that they need to carry on. So it's a structural problem. The finance capitalists taking over governments right across the West, and the Russians, etc., the Iranians, the Chinese are not going to have that.
Okay. Paolo, we have 1 minute left. Tell us if you know of any exits out of this situation.
Well, in 1 minute, this is quite a challenge, but the best way is to start recognizing that the Western supremacy is over. That's the reality. It's an important part of the world economy and power, but it's no more the only one, and cannot be in the position of dictating to the rest of the world what to do. So if this would happen, means that our leaders would be capable of sitting down with the rest of the world and try to redefine an order which is beneficial to all.
Okay. On that note, we'll come to the end of this show. Let me thank our guests. We had historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling in Bristol and Secretary General of the CIPF Foundation, Paolo Raffone in Brussels. And thank you for watching this edition of The Spotlight. I've been your host, Behruz Najaf, and I'll see you next time.